Hello, good evening. Welcome to, I think, what's the 46th of 47 hustings of this leadership campaign. I'm Ned Simons. I'm the politics news editor of HuffPost UK. I'm joined obviously by Leila Moran and Ed Davey. We're live on YouTube and Facebook. We'll be watching for your questions as well. And we're joined by British Sign Language interpreter too. I think it's just under a week until we find out which of you two is going to kind of emerge victorious. And tonight's topic is party strategy. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off for everyone. It's going to be about 80 minutes long. I'm going to ask both candidates about 10 questions that have been submitted by party members, which kind of cover broad topics of what people are interested to ask you both, and maybe a couple from me along the way as well. And we're going to start with opening speeches, about 3 minutes. And Leila's going to go first, as Ed went first last time. So Leila, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Ned. Thank you all for watching. In politics, a journey back to relevance and success starts by acknowledging what went wrong. And we can't deny that over the last decade, mistakes have been made. Voters have made that clear to us. Our council base has halved and we're down to just 11 MPs. I worry deeply about the impact of this decline on you, our members. Listening to you in this election, I hear how many are demotivated and some are saying they're preparing to leave the party. And in particular, I feel for those hardworking local councillors and activists who have suffered personally as a result of poor national decisions. But I equally worry about the impact of this decline on our country. Because without the Lib Dems at every level of government, who will oppose authoritarianism and populism where it creeps in? Who will push, like no other party, for electoral reform? And who will stand up and defend the most vulnerable and most marginalised in society? There is a way forward. I am standing because in my heart, I'm convinced that with the right plan and strategy, our party can do better than 6% in the polls. I can feel the courage and the strength within our membership, ready to work together to rebuild our party and rebuild trust with voters. This is our key task, to show voters that we've learned from our mistakes, that we are ready to listen to them and represent them again. I know our members are ready to move our party forward together and give our country the compelling liberal voice it so desperately needs. And with the right leader, we can win again at every level. I will help implement the general election review. Its findings chime strongly with the feedback I've had from the over 75 listening sessions I've had with 300 local parties across the country. And I will also lead our party to better live our values, listening to voters and show that we are on their side. Together, we can deliver a core message through a strong media presence and an empowered activist base. This is my plan: to listen, to rebuild, to regain trust, to work with you, to restore our relevance and be successful again at every level. Straight away, I'd have a sharp focus on maximising our gains in May, in the Scottish, Welsh, mayoral and local elections, and then in every round of local elections thereafter. And I have a plan for our party and a vision for our country. You can view it at voteleila.org/plan. My aim and my reason for asking you to vote for me to be our next leader is to change our party for the better so that we can win at every level again and move forward together. Please vote for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. And Ed, now if you'd like to go as well.
Thank you, Ned. Friends, my core strategic aim is to win more votes for the Liberal Democrats, to win more council seats across the whole country, more MSPs in Scotland, more MSs in Wales, more AMs in London, more MPs, more elected Liberal Democrats. We all know winning has been and will be tough for our party. From first past the post to the right-wing media, the pitch is currently stacked against us. Nevertheless, I believe we can do much, much better than we've been doing, for two reasons. First, the Thornhill General Election Review, if we implement it. Second, our revival in local government, if we build on it. Let me start with Dorothy's review. It didn't just cover 2019, her review went back to 2015. And it makes somber reading. It shows unequivocally that our party is not in a good state. But it also shows there are changes we can make, changes that we control, which can lead to significant improvements at elections. The review suggests we listen to voters. Hardly rocket science, but there's more than a hint there that for too long we've been talking to ourselves, ignoring the voters' priorities. Under me, that will change. With its 61 pages and recommendations, the election review is clear. There are no quick fixes. We have a major rebuilding task. I'm proud Dorothy Thornhill is backing me as leader for that rebuilding task. I've seen new foundations for our party laid before. I remember the first nationwide election 11 months into Paddy Ashdown's leadership. We scored 5.9%, well behind the Greens. But I remember how Paddy then led our rebuilding. With new foundations in our local government base. Across the country, our party revived. One reason why we won Kingston and Surbiton in 1997 by 56 votes after 3 recounts was because we had won control of Kingston Council 3 years previously. And now, the good news is we are winning again at the local level. Ever since Tim Farron said, pick a ward and win it, and members across the country responded, we've seen some pretty good results in council elections. That gives me hope. So I will be the champion of local government if I'm leader. Friends, we must rebuild teams across the country, campaigning teams capable of beating any party, Tory, Labour, SNP, whoever, with strong messages relevant to voters' concerns. In this campaign, I've argued for a message: greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. Because I believe that speaks to the voters and works well for our local government teams. Elect me as leader to lead our team so we win again. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Before we move to questions from party members, I just wanted to put one to myself. Obviously, this is about party strategy, and the party strategy for the last 2 elections has been very much focused on Europe. For whatever reason, the party hasn't performed well in 2017 or 2019. And not to channel David Cameron, perhaps, is it perhaps time the Lib Dems stopped banging on about Europe? And Leda, if I could ask you first.
Well, Ned, I will never apologise for taking the stance that we did. I am a proud pro-European. I'm an internationalist. I'm an internationalist because I'm a liberal, because I believe in working together with others to solve the big issues that we have. It's why we believe in localism and community politics as well. I believe it was the right thing to do. Just look at what a no-deal Brexit, which we are marching towards, Barnier today saying, in fact, talks are moving backwards, what it would do to our country. But in terms of how we now relate to voters, and people often ask, is this the moment to go to rejoin? I actually think that we have to accept that by taking the stance that we did in an election, or 2 elections now that have been very divisive, there is a sense from voters that are just not on their side, not just on this issue, but on every issue. I remember in an election door knocking session in December, knocking on a door in Kidlington, a very Brexity part of my constituency. Man opens the door. He says, you're the Remainer. We have nothing in common. And he slammed the door in my face. And of course, that's not true. So what I want to do is to focus on those bread and butter issues that actually are in common between me and that man. Us and people across the country who believe in strong public services, in strong communities, and businesses that are empowered. These are the things that will get them to listen to us again. We have to show them that we're on their side. And I do think a moment will come where the public mood will shift and we might start talking about Europe again. But I don't think it should be the first thing that we say to them on a door anymore.
Thanks, Leda. And Ed, same question to you. Is it about time the party stopped banging on about Europe?
Well, I'm a passionate pro-European, and under me, the party will always be the most pro-European party in our country. We have been for a long time, and in the past, we never used to bang on about it. We talked about education, we talked about health, we talked about crime, the environment. We talked about the issues that voters cared about, their aspirations, their hopes. And I think we went wrong in the run up to 2019, because we talked too much about Europe, we didn't appeal to other people, and that then lost us the ability to pursue our European policies. So my strategy will always be about how can we win those Liberal Democrat votes, and that will always start with the voter. You know, I said at this time last year, the last leadership election, we need to reach out to leave voters, to leave communities, not because I wanted us in any way to stop being anti-Brexit. I was passionate about bollocks to Brexit. But I knew that if we just went on that, and if we went down the way we did, we would exclude 50% of the electorate. I mean, what sort of political strategy excludes 50% of the electorate before you've even started your campaign? It was a nonsense. And so under me, I would make sure that in the seats we need to win for our councils, for our MPs and for wherever, we do start out getting on the voters' side. And, I will be getting out of London. I will be going around the country, listening to people, listening to party members, listening to voters. So our message at all levels is relevant to voters wherever they live in the country.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll go to questions from party members now. The first one is from Heather, who put it quite bluntly. She says, how would you both answer people who won't vote for the Lib Dems simply because they regard you as losers? I think, Ed, would you like to answer that one first?
Well, because we're winning here, to quote the slogan. Where we are in second place, where we've won the control of the council, we can prove to people by election results that we are winning, that we're not losers. It is more difficult when you're in third or fourth place, I accept, but I wouldn't give up on those areas. But I would focus inevitably about the things that you need to focus on to persuade people that we are worth voting for. And so, in the 91 seats where we're second place, 80 of which against the Tories, we need to have those bar charts, have those messages, make it absolutely clear that if we want to get rid of the Tories, you've got to vote Liberal Democrat in those 80 seats. And equally, where we're fighting Labour or the SNP, where we are the challengers, we're the ones to vote for. And frankly, Ned, that's been a strategy that has worked many times, before. And, I think, if I have the mandate to be the permanent leader, be the one leader rather than a temporary co-leader, if I have that mandate, I think we can reform the party with the general election review from Dorothy Thornhill, and we can tell people that we can win in so many more areas.
And Layla, same question to you from Heather. She wants to know, what do you tell people who won't vote for the party because they simply regard you as a party of losers?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And I mean, this is a question that I have come across on doors as well before. And it's certainly not helped that the latest YouGov poll, I think it is, has us level pegging with the Green Party. And that just makes it all the harder for when you are trying to win people over, especially in areas where you're starting again, which are so many of the seats that we need to win back and where we need to move forwards, that just doesn't help. So I've looked deeply into this, and it comes in two parts. The first is when you look at how voters vote, very often with their heart and not just their head, they look at a political party, they look at that party's leader, and they ask themselves two questions. Can I trust them? And can I count on them to deliver for me? And that's well documented in the research. And there's two ways you can achieve that. One is in the trust. I think that is where we have to start. We have to recognize many of these voters aren't just voting for us, are not voting for us because we are losing. It's also because they don't trust us. So that's where the listening is so important. Let's understand them. And in the first 100 days and beyond, the first year, in fact, I want to continue what I did after the 2019 general election, because when I was asking myself these questions, I went and spoke to voters. I went to Leeds, I went to Sheffield, I went to Devon and Cornwall, I went to Kent, I went to Wales. I was about to go to Scotland and coronavirus intervened. And I can't wait to get back on that trail. Ask them, what is it they want from us? How can we show them that what we're talking about is relevant to them and their families? But then we have to empower our local parties to be able to show them that on the ground they are delivering for them too. And that's why winning council seats has to be the start. There are a number of people comparing me to Jo in this election, perhaps just because we're females. But actually, the Jo that I'm thinking of as I'm looking ahead at the task that we need to rebuild as a party is actually Jo Grimond. When we were at this position before, we rebuilt by focusing in on local elections, by showing people that if you vote Lib Dem, you then get Lib Dems. And if you get Lib Dems get things done. We need a national message that can help, not hinder, our local parties. And it's in that co-creation of the message, starting with the voter, that's how we're going to win again and show people that we are relevant.
Thank you. So actually, question 2, obviously, these questions are all about winning elections, it's party strategy. And Kevin Collins wants to know, what 3 steps would you take to make sure the current government is defeated at the next election? So from both of you, kind of 3 key things you would do. And I think start Layla this time, if you could go first, please.
Thank you. Well, step 1 has to be to rebuild our party, to empower our activists. And I reflect on when I first joined the party. I was a teacher before I was a parliamentarian. And I've always believed that if you want people to do their best, to get the best out of them, it's how I operate as a leader and a boss as well, is actually you empower them. You give them the tools that they need. If we were a commercial organization, we would be investing far more in our volunteers, our activists, our campaign staff. We have to implement that general election review. It's so important that it's going to get the mandate that it deserves in this leadership election. But make no mistake, that is going to be a difficult task, but it starts by rebuilding the machine of the party. The second thing, in my view, that we need to do is to rebuild that broad message that is good enough to attract votes from both Tory-facing voters, but also the centre-left. Because even in those seats where we are in second place, we win those by essentially doing 2 things. Well, 3. The first is you set up the Lib Dem as the person who can beat the Tory in those seats. The second thing is you convince those centre-left progressive voters that you have enough in common for them to vote for that candidate. And in the case of Oxford West and Abingdon, we went a step further. The Greens stood down for me, but also started campaigning for me as part of a progressive alliance of voters and campaigners that included Labour members and even Conservative members who didn't agree with what Theresa May was proposing in the hard Brexit. And then that campaigning force, that force took those messages to the Conservative voters and they came over, and that's how we overturned a 10,000 majority all in one go. But the third thing is linked to that. What we need to avoid is what we saw in places like Wimbledon at the last election, where the Labour Party and Labour Party activists in particular take pride at shouting, "Yellow Tories, you're the same as them." We lost so much trust with those voters, but also those activists love to take the fight to us, even if it's not in their own interests. We have to reprise what we saw between Paddy Ashdown and Blair in the run-up to 97. And it's this tacit understanding between the leaders of the parties that actually our common foe is Boris Johnson and this shambolic government. And that in those seats where only we can take seats off the Tories, that we put down those swords, that we have a truce, and that's signalled from the top by us not attacking each other. So those 3 things combined, I believe, are the way to depriving Boris Johnson of his majority at the next election. The country's future depends on it.
Thank you, Layla. And Ed, now to you. What 3 things would you do to ensure that this government is defeated at the next election?
3 main things that will apply in most seats. First of all, build the Liberal Democrat vote. Secondly, squeeze the Labour vote. And thirdly, steal lots of soft Tory votes. How am I going to do that? Well, building our own party to be stronger is the fundamental first step. We have been dramatically underperforming, but the general election review of Dorothy Thornhill, which I was proud to co-commission, sets the direction of where we need to go. It has some tough messages, but it has some basic messages. We must follow them. We must make it clear to voters what we stand for. It's been an absolute disgrace that people don't know what our party is about. and the branding of the party has been damaged over time. And we need to get that right again so people instinctively know what we stand for, even if they don't agree with us. So building that strong independent Liberal Democrat is number one. Number two is, how do we squeeze that Labour Party? Now, in many areas, it'll just be because the data is very clear that we're the only ones who can beat the Tories. But I do believe, having been a sort of child of the Ashdown era, when I saw how Ashdown and Blair, in a very carefully choreography, managed to, without any formal pact, without any deal, managed to get tactical voting to work against the Tories and for progressive parties. It was an informal understanding built at many levels. We need to recreate that. I think it's possible now because of Starmer, in a way it wasn't possible with Corbyn. And I think you will find many Labour activists will not repeat what they did in so many seats. And I think they will go off and try to beat the Tories and leave us to beat the Tories where we can win. And then there's those soft Tory votes, some of whom are really there for the taking. Now Corbyn has left the scene. They were more afraid of Corbyn than they were of Brexit. Now, if we can appeal to them through good economic policies, through a leader who appeals to them, and a leader who can set out a very clear message, which doesn't scare them, but actually understands and puts over to them that there is a progressive alternative. You don't have to go to this right-wing, nasty Tory approach. And I think we can therefore win over lots of soft Tories. It's what I've been doing throughout my political career. I fought the Tories all my political life. In 7 elections, I've beaten them 6 times out of 7. And you know, I love beating the Tories. And the best way to beat the Tories is take their voters from them. So that's the 3 things. Build the Liberal Democrat Party, squeeze that Labour vote with an informal understanding, and then go after those soft Tory votes, which are there for the taking.
Thank you both. Question 3 is actually connected to something you both spoke about in your answers to the previous one. It's from Julian Parsons, and it's about cooperation with other parties. Julian asks, will you cooperate with other parties to aggregate the anti-Tory vote? Could this realistically include the SNP? And what will you do if Labour all take and no give? And that question is to Ed, so you first.
Well, let me say at the start that I don't mind working with other parties after an election. I believe, particularly when we're trying to stop the Tories on their right-wing policies on Brexit and so on, you have to work cross-party, be it in the council or in Parliament. But it's a different kettle of fish when you come to the actual elections. And yes, I think there is room for informal understandings, but I think national pacts and deals don't work. I think the Unite to Remain project, I don't think that was a huge success. We'll see what the report says, and I want to prejudge that, but it didn't look like it was a good for us. And there's a real misunderstanding by those people who think that if we stood down for Labour, assuming they might do for us, which I doubt it, we stood down for Labour, our votes would transfer to the Labour Party, enable them to win. That's simply not the case. A lot of our voters, their second preference is the Conservative Party. And we don't own voters. No party owns voters. And so there's a real misunderstanding about people who peddle this idea that we can have joint election campaigns, that we can somehow come together by not standing. We've also got to realise that we have a job to take on Labour MPs and Labour councils in many parts of the country. So informal sort of non-aggression understanding is a much better way than some sort of joint election campaign force. And when it comes to the SNP, I tell you what I do. I talk to Willie Rennie. I talk to Scottish Liberal Democrats. I think it'd be completely wrong for the federal leader to go over and say that we know, how it works in Scotland, particularly when you're an English MP. I would want to get Willie's advice, get the advice of the Scottish Liberal Democrat campaign team, and go with that advice.
And Layla, I'll repeat the question for you as well. It was from Julian Parsons, who asked, will you cooperate with other parties to aggregate the anti-Tory vote? Could this realistically include the SNP? And what would you do if Labour all take and no give?
Well, thank you, Julian. And of course, at the last election, we kind of tried this. Labour did not play ball. And that was really important to say, because there was a perception that they might, some wanted to, and I spoke to a number of Labour MPs that wanted to as well. But actually their constitution precludes it. What we saw was that the Unite to Remain movement ended up actually demoralising a lot of local parties, because it was very anti our own values. When we say that we are a bottom-up, locally driven, ground-up party, Unite to Remain, and the way it was handled felt very top-down, very imposed on people. And I don't think that that is what we should return to. The model that I think we should be following is actually what we did here in Oxford, Western Abingdon. And it started by a very tentative conversation between actually me and a former Green Party candidate in the seat, where we appreciated that unless we did something, unless we created a movement on the ground here, we were not going to overturn a 10,000 Tory majority in one go. And there was a lot of trust building that needed to happen, a lot of negotiation. I had a hustings that, believe me, makes all of these 46, 47 hustings that I've had as part of this leadership contest pale into comparison. I left that building shaken. I was convinced that I did not convince them, and yet they unanimously declared that they were going to stand down. And that then formed a grassroots movement from the bottom up, where Labour members and voters, sometimes in the dead of night, wearing hoodies, were delivering leaflets for us. And they did it because they realized that we had the messages that made sense to them. We were talking about the issues that they cared about. In this case, it was saving Abingdon Community Hospital. It was bring back Sure Start. It was bread and butter stuff, education, the environment, the economy. These are the 3 E's I've been talking about in this campaign. It resonates as strongly with the centre left as it does with the soft conservatives that we needed to win over. And that's the thing we need to remember, is that that cooperation is in our votes. It's a broad message that we need, and it will attract from both sides. Charles Kennedy did this incredibly effectively when he was leader. That is what I want to emulate. And it means that we can then take the fight to Labour in complacent council areas where we need to. We have to realise that just because someone out there hasn't voted Lib Dem before, they won't do it unless we can find the message that's going to work for them on the ground. And we have to convince the other parties that in those seats that only we can take the votes off the Tories, their best bet is to not just stand down for us, not just vote for us, but if they can, come out campaigning with us. It works. We did it here. We then repeated it in the 2019 general election. I achieved 53% of the vote, the highest ever for any candidate and for any party in the seat's history. I know this works, but it needs to be led from the bottom up.
Can I just come back to you, Leila, quickly about specifically on the SNP point and how you with them?
So the SNP point, I mean, actually Ed's absolutely right with this one. It has to be a decision that is taken with Willie Rennie. And the other point I will make, just quietly, is whilst the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has won the admiration of many for being a very good communicator throughout this coronavirus crisis. She often takes the fight to Boris Johnson, and there are many in England in particular who admire her for it. But we also have to appreciate that what the SNP is doing is fighting for a Britain that is fundamentally a different Britain to the one that we want, one that is split apart, where they're using the Tories as an excuse to try and break up the family of 4 nations. My view is that actually we are always stronger when we fight with others, where we make that positive case for why we should stay together, that emotional case for why we should be helping children and care homes in Scotland as much as I may care about them in Devon and Cornwall and in Oxford. We have to show the people of Scotland that actually voting Lib Dem is the way to both have greater independence at a local level without losing a family of 4 nations. Willie Rennie is the one who should lead on that. And I think we need to be very, very careful about the SNP and appreciate that whilst they may seem like one thing from across the border, actually in Scotland, they are very, very different. The reality on the ground is different to the perception.
Okay, the next question is from Alex Jagger, and it's the question Lib Dem candidates and leaders always get asked, which is about coalitions. So Layla, I'll come to you first for this one actually. And Alex wants to know, what would you ask for if you're invited to be part of a coalition government? And what would be a non-negotiable in any discussions around that?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alex. And I think to this question, and I think, well, first of all, the thing we need to do is to win enough seats to get into that position. I can tell you that outright, I am focused on getting Boris Johnson out. Him and his cabinet, just if I needed extra motivation, Gavin Williamson has given it to me. I mean, you'd think that Priti Patel and Chris Grayling and others would be enough, but no, he's really come into his own this week, and I've been leading the calls for him to go. But actually, this whole government needs to go. We can now see that their complacency, their lack of ability to deal with coronavirus, their incompetence is literally costing lives. And I can't even think what they're going to do to this country over the next few years. They have to go. So any coalition with the Tories is out. And I think we need to be very clear about that from a very early point. With Labour, I think it's potentially a bit different. Keir Starmer is a very different kettle of fish to Jeremy Corbyn. By the way, this helps us in many of the Tory-facing seats that we want Conservative voters to vote for us. The ones even in my seat, and proud as I am of my own result, it would have been higher had it not been for Corbyn. Literally, he scared people away from us as well. But we have to wait and see what we get to at that point. The first thing that I think we need to try and do is to create some kind of consensus around electoral reform. And I should say I'm already part of behind the scenes groups, progressives, who are trying to influence the Labour Party right now. And something I want to do is to create a consensus around proportional representation. I know that Keir Starmer has some sympathy towards this, and there are many in his party who actually are actively campaigning to get the Labour Party to change their stance on this. And if they do, then that absolutely has to be the bottom line, because the argument for coalition is one where we are doing it in the national interest, but also we have to make sure it doesn't hurt our party. And electoral reform doesn't just hurt our party. First past the post hurts this country. It leads to these perverse results like this 80-seat majority that is not reflective of the government that people voted for. So electoral reform is right up there, but I will not be signing any papers until I also see the small print. So let's focus on building our strength first. And when we get there, you as members will have as much of a say as well.
Thank you. Ed, and the same question to you. This is from Alex. He wants to know, what would you ask for if you're invited to be part of a coalition government, again, for you? And what would be a non-negotiable this time?
Well, as an introduction to this, first of all, unless we are a strong party, we won't be in any serious way in this territory. So we have got to build our strength. That's number one. Number two, absolutely no deal, no coalition, no supply and confidence agreement with the Tories. They are beyond the pale, whether it's Brexit or the right-wing policies. So the only serious option would be with Labour. So let's imagine between us, and I'm putting the SNP aside for this, that between us, Labour MPs and Liberal Democrat MPs could get a majority if we did some sort of deal. I think Keir Starmer would be interested, but we must make it clear that we won't be pushovers. And I sometimes worry that the first law of negotiation is being forgot by a lot of people. You've got to make it clear that you would walk away, because if you don't, you're never going to get what you need. You talk about what your red line would be. There won't be any red lines because they won't believe that you'll have any, you'll keep to them. I've negotiated in business, I've negotiated within the party, I've negotiated in government, I've negotiated around the cabinet table, I've negotiated the EU, I've negotiated the United Nations. I've got a lot of experience negotiating. And you really have to in those critical moments, because negotiations are often under very pressure, huge pressure, with the press, the business, the markets, your own party, all pushing you to do things. And you've got to have the strength to stand back and say, no, we're going to take time over this. We're going to be clear to the other side that we would walk away unless we get what we want. And it's for that reason, my experience in negotiation, that, Ned, I'm not going to set out what my red lines are. Yeah, this could be recorded. It could be put everywhere. You know, why would you do that?
Go
I
on.
mean, people will know that we have commitments to things like electoral reform, climate change policy, stronger local democracy, the European agenda, and so on. They'll know that, right? But we don't want to tell them what our negotiation position is. That's nuts. I won't do it.
I just have to come back to both of you, the question on this same topic. I think I'll start with you, Ed. You were cabinet minister in the coalition, but you know, speaking just electorally, that actually didn't work if you look at the 2015 election result. So why should party members believe that you won't repeat the same mistakes again as leader as what happened in 2015? Why should they put their trust in you?
Well, first of all, let's go back to 2010 when the coalition was agreed. It was agreed by various groups within the party, then put to a special conference. And the vast majority of people at that conference voted for it. And I would want to ensure that the party members had a similar voice in any coalition approval or arrangement. So that's the first thing. I would insist on ensuring the members were involved so they can trust that. Indeed, I believe that is still the party strategy and rules, that the members have to be involved in the way we were in 2010. But what happened between 2010 and 2015, there's lots of debates. Obviously, I was there and I remember it all too well. There were mistakes made, as every government made mistakes, but the biggest mistake was how it was handled politically. And, you know, I'm not going to throw blame everywhere, but, you know, we did not do what we've been advised by European sister liberal parties to do back in 2010, which was to maintain our distinctive identity throughout the coalition. It was a choice by the leadership not to do that, and it was a mistake. And some of us spoke out of it at the time. And in 2015, the election, a manifesto was put together, which was not distinctive. It was a negotiation document. And some of us in private and in the parliamentary party, and there were very few of us, some of us spoke out against that and said this was not distinctive enough. And I said at the time, you know, if you're going to the middle of the road, you better wear a high visibility jacket or you'll get run over. So I remember what happened. And that's why if people are wanting to get rid of this Conservative government, if people are wanting us to negotiate with the Labour Party for the possibility of a future coalition, they surely want someone who's not just a good negotiator and proven good negotiator, but someone who can know what the lessons were, the real lessons were from the coalition, will make sure those mistakes weren't made. I didn't want them made at the time. I'll never let them be repeated.
Thank you, Ed. And then for Layla, whilst Ed was part of the coalition with the Conservatives, you weren't. If you're going into negotiations over any future coalition or agreement with Labour, you know, can the party members have the trust that you'll have the experience to negotiate with Keir Starmer, you know, former Director of Public Prosecutions? Should they be able to trust you that you have the ability and experience to do that?
Absolutely, they should, because the approach that I take to anything is that, first of all, every situation itself is going to be different, but also I am not a one-man band. I am not here to have my face on the side of a bus and to run a presidential campaign that's all about me. No, this is about the party. This is about using every sinew that we have access to, including those who were there the last time, but also the many people who have other experiences in the party membership itself. And when we put together that team and when those decisions are made, it's one that we make together. It's in our constitution that it's the parliamentary party, the federal board, and a special conference that then decides if that's good enough and we go into that coalition. But to the mistakes themselves, I mean, actually, I don't think the mistake was going into coalition at the time. I voted for it. We did it in good faith. It's what the country was crying out for at the time. There was the financial crash. Gordon Brown had lost his mandate. It was the right thing to do. The mistakes came with the politics within the coalition, with us being seen and perceived by voters to be abandoning our own principles. And it's not just about tuition fees. And I signed that pledge, and I still to this day feel that that was a huge mistake, but it was not the only mistake. The bedroom tax is one of the most devastating things that that government did. It affected huge numbers of vulnerable people. People were pushed into poverty because of it. Children were pushed into poverty because of it. The vast majority who were affected by it were disabled people. So when, in the 2015 election and elections beyond, we've had, just like in 2019, I frankly had thought that the coalition had gone away. But then you saw that question time debate that Jo Swinson took part of, the Andrew Neil interview. Every time she spoke about wanting to tackle poverty, ignorance and conformity, all the stuff that we want to talk about as liberals, it went right back to that voting record. And I think we are going to get nowhere with this now unless we can tell voters, send them a powerful signal that we understand that we've got things wrong. And it's not just coalition, it's been since then as well. But that we've understood that we've made mistakes, that we are listening to them, that we are on their side, and that we are now a party that's going to stand up for them and move forward. And that coalition record and what happened then is still fresh in the minds of many of those people that we need to get voting for us again. And I do think now that there is this opportunity to renew, reinvigorate, and rebuild our party, not forgetting about our past, because it will always be there, but sending that clear signal that we've understood what went wrong and that we are changing.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to a different topic now, and this is a question from Pauline Allen. I think, Ed, if I go to you first, please. Pauline asks, with Dominic Cummings at the helm of government and the use of shadowy analytics and secretive social media messaging, how do you propose to push past this barrier to ensure the Lib Dem message is heard, particularly with the media?
Well, the good news is that the Tories are now on the defensive big time. Dominic Cummings is on the defensive big time. You know, when he made his infamous trip, you know, I was on the media for about 72 hours. I led the charge saying he should go. And I think that spoke to the country, and the country now, I think, feels that the Tories are now their old type Tories, one rule for them, another rule for the rest of us. And I think the mishandling by Gavin Williamson, the mishandling by Johnson, the mishandling by Matt Hancock, you know, it's now legion. And, you know, I think we can expose that. And as leader, I would have a huge team of people helping me. You know, I'm delighted in this election to be supported by Daisy Cooper, you know, one of our stars, the new MP for St. Albans. Her advice, I think, is fantastic in terms of, you know, media and campaigning. You know, Tim Farron, with all his experience as a former party leader. And then there's great people like Sarah Olney and Munira Wilson, who are supporting me and who are part of the team I would use both to get on the media and to campaign. And, you know, there's one thing that you want to be clear about. Media for media's sake doesn't work. I've seen politician after politician, Liberal Democrats and others, do lots on the media, but frankly, they've had no message discipline and their message hasn't cut through. My experience of over 20 years in Parliament, where I've been grilled by every single tough interviewer out there, you know, I believe that I've got what it takes to get that message discipline. So when we get those precious nanoseconds, we use them and get our message over with that rigor and robustness that we need. You know, and I build a team beyond Westminster. You know, we've got fantastic council leaders. We've got all the great people in Scotland and Wales, from the amazing Kirsty Williams, the education minister, who showed Gavin Williamson how to do it, to Willie, of course, and some of our brilliant local government leaders. You know, I'd want to build a team so that in the regional media, in the Welsh media, the Scottish media, we are getting our message over, working as one team. And I think we could build a force that, you know, Dominic Cummings would soon quiver before.
Thanks, Ed. And Layla, the same question to you, which was from Pauline, with Dominic Cummings at the helm of government, and as she says, the use of shadowy analytics and secretive social media messaging. How do you propose to push past this barrier and enable the Lib Dem message to be heard, particularly in the media?
Thanks, Pauline. The thrust of your question around the way that social media has infected our democracy actually is a general point. I'm very, very concerned about this. As part of this leadership campaign, I've been talking about the need for a digital Bill of Rights. This is party policy already, but actually I think we need to now be putting some flesh on this bone. because we have to lead the charge. There's nothing more important than the integrity of our democracy. But who better than the Liberal Democrats to make the case for that? Essentially, this is a protection of an individual's civil liberties and the ability to know that, you know, they are not themselves going to get manipulated by Russian bot farms coming out of St. Petersburg, which is exactly, by the way, what has been happening. We also need to move away from dinosaur campaign tactics. Actually, there are things that Dominic Cummings and the team around him are doing that is just more modern ways of campaigning. And yes, some of it is shadowy, but some of it we have to catch up. And there are ways that I think we should be sharpening that side of our campaigning. We heard a lot of people say far too many leaflets at the last election, not least if we're a Green Party, that starts to become a counter to some of our messages. Actually, I think we can get sharper on that front. But in terms of the use of the media itself, as you'll have seen throughout this election, I do get media cut through. I've had over 500 pieces of positive media, and I use it in a way that gets our message across. Yesterday, I was on the front page of The Telegraph, ahead of the Labour spokesperson, calling the government to account and Gavin Williamson to account on the BTEC debacle. Whenever I have done it in this leadership election, it's in a way that spreads that broad liberal message that gets across the fact that we are rebuilding as a party, that we understand the mistakes of the past, and that when there is a big national issue that comes along, I get a fair hearing from even the right-wing press. But it's not just about getting your name in there. I also use the media to campaign. So today, you might have seen, we've been talking as part of the all-party group on coronavirus. I'm leading the inquiry on that. And we've released our first set of recommendations. And one of them is to seek a zero COVID strategy for England so that we can hold the government to account over its shambolic treating of the pandemic so far. But at the very beginning of this pandemic, I secured the coronavirus compensation scheme. And I did that by amassing a group of parliamentarians, over 70 in the House. We wrote to Boris Johnson. It came off the back, by the way, of a local phone-in with my local radio station, a constituent who'd contacted me saying that he was worried about his own life working on the front line and the future for his 9-year-old daughter. Could we do something about it? And then we campaigned. But what really made it happen was a call I got from the deputy editor of the Daily Express newspaper, who you wouldn't normally associate with being a newspaper friendly to Lib Dems, but they said, we like this campaign. They ran it on their front page for 5 days. They credited me and the party with it, and we got it done. And so now those bereaved families who have so tragically passed away due to coronavirus, who were serving on the front line, get £60,000 more than they would have done before. The media is an important tool in how we campaign for change in our country. And in the 4th place in Parliament party that we are right now, 6% in the polls, we need to use every single way that we can to affect positive change and hold this government to account. I have a track record of doing that, and it's what I will continue to do as leader.
Thank you. A quick look from me, just kind of a quick answer from both of you. We're talking about party campaigning tools, and actually, Leila, you mentioned other party campaigns. During the last election, there was a bit of a controversy over kind of Lib Dem leaflets that were in effect disguised as local newspapers. As from both of you, Ed and then Leila, would you be happy for that campaign technique to continue in the next election? Campaign leaflets that are made to look like local newspapers?
Well, to be honest, I'd need to see the ones that you're particularly focusing on. I mean, we've used tabloids in our constituency, and it's pretty clear they're from the Liberal Democrats. You'd have to be pretty off the wall not to realise they were from Liberal Democrats. They've got Liberal Democrats all over them. So the question is, are they in some way trying to hide the fact that it's about messages from a political party? So I think it's a little bit more subtle than the way it was portrayed in the last election campaign. Far more subtle than that.
Thank you. And Leila, the same question. Are you happy for those kind of campaign leaflets to continue?
Yes, I would, so long as it's very clear on the front that it is paid for and delivered by volunteers from the Liberal Democrats. The ones that we were putting out in Oxford, West and Abingdon had that underneath the title in 16 point font. I think where it starts to go wrong is when you try and hide it, where it's in just the small print somewhere else and it's not clear. My view is so long as you are open and transparent about what you are doing and you're very clear about the source and what that newspaper or newspaper-esque leaflet is coming from, then they have an important part to play, and I think they should be used, yes.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is a new topic. It's from Simon Banks. And Simon wants to know, Leyla, this is to you first. How should the party overcome the disconnects between activists who have a clear idea of our cause and a public which has no idea what we're about, and between local parties with one message and a central election team with another?
Mm-hmm. Simon, you are so right. You are so right. And in the last few months that I've been listening to activists around the country, this has been the top message, particularly at the last election. And you can point to Revoke specifically, but actually it's not just Revoke, it's a general sense that the Westminster's too far away, the HQ is not connected, that somehow people there know best, and people on the ground who are in fact closest to the voters don't know. And when they were then receiving leaflets that were landing on doors counter to the messages that they were trying to get across, that were in fact in some cases unhelpful to the candidates, that were losing us votes, there needs to be a way that that campaigning is more joined up. Now, since then, I know that there are people at HQ that understand this. There is closer working, although it needs to get closer, between them, the regions and local parties. There's closer working also through ALDC, which I have a huge amount of respect for. But the general principle that we are a bottom-up party is not something that we're living in our own values at the moment. The way that we campaign is very top-down. This is message you shall deliver. When in fact what we need are broad enough messages coming from HQ and coming from the leader that then can be easily adapted for local parties. So that when people on the doorsteps are hearing the air war and what's going on the ground, the two seamlessly match, rather than that hindering, rather than helping sense of those messages. And the way you create those messages is you start by listening to voters. So that question around the activists and the people around them. We need to take a humble pill, everybody. Where we are now is not working. It's been 10 years now of it not working. People have lost seats over it. We have to change. And there are parts of the country now that still don't have Lib Dem councillors at all sitting on their councils. We have to reverse that. And it starts by listening to voters. And as leader, actually, I want to listen to you. I've said that I'm a listening leader. I have a collaborative approach to leadership. That is how I would conduct myself and put myself in that humble position with you activists guiding me, with the voters guiding me, so that we get those messages right from top to bottom.
And Ed, I'll repeat the question for you as well. So Simon wanted to know, how should the party overcome the disconnect between activists who have a clear idea of our cause and the public which has no idea what we're about, and between local parties with one message and a central election team with another?
Well, Simon, thanks for the questions. On your first question, I think activists shouldn't worry necessarily that the voters don't totally understand liberalism in its depth. I think the core to good community politics, winning people over, understanding their issues, is to talk to them, is to listen to them, and then find ways to connect with them. So in this general election, in this leadership election campaign, I've talked a lot about carers. I think caring is a massive issue out there, not just post-COVID, but pre-COVID. There are 10 million carers in our country, 3 times as many people who voted Liberal Democrat. Maybe we can relate to people about the Liberal Democrat perspective on caring. And, that's the trick in local campaign, is to understand what are on voters' minds, which could be very local, could be across the borough, could be a national issue, and then give them the Liberal Democrat perspective on that issue. And that gradually then deals with that disconnect, Simon. On the issue about local campaign and national campaigning, I've been distraught about how this has gone over recent years. After 2017 election, when I won back my seat, I went to the campaign staff and I said, look, your leaflets didn't help me win. In fact, I think I'd have had a bigger majority but for your leaflets. And I went with Alistair Carmichael, the MP for Orkney and Shetland, Chief Whip, And he put it even more bluntly. He said, do you know what, campaign person? I go to the Royal Mail delivery office in Orkney, and I asked them to give me the national leaflets and the national mailings from your department and to put them in the back of my car. And I drove them home and put them in the garage to make sure they were not delivered. So, you know, myself and Alistair were telling them back in 2017 not to do what they then did in 2019. And I was so cross about what they were doing, and they just were not listening. And they spent £6 million delivering national leaflets via Royal Mail, which I think undermined a lot of our message because their messages weren't right. You know, let me give you a classic example. You know, when I'm putting out a leaflet in my area on the health service, I talk about Surbiton Health Centre, which I managed to get built, or the Merit Centre in Chessington, Kingston Hospital A&E and maternity unit, which I saved. I talk about those issues and then bring in what I'm going to do in terms of other NHS campaigns locally, and then maybe talk about the National Party's policy. The National Party was, you know, after our leaflet locally delivered and paid for and designed to really target our message to the local community, they would put their leaflet on top of ours, undermining the strength of ours, saying that if Liberal Democrats win, we'll spend 10 billion on the NHS or whatever it was. Which leaflet do you think was most plausible? Which leaflet do you think the voter could believe in and trust? You know, the National Campaigns Department just lost touch with reality, with how we campaign in our party. And one of the things I'm so relieved of that's in the Dorothy Thornhill review is a clear recommendation that we stop doing what we were doing in, frankly, 2015, 2017, and 2019. You know, they were told at the time it wasn't working and shouldn't be done, but they didn't listen. In the future, those mistakes will not be repeated if I have anything to do with it. And you know, then I think we can get that bottom-up campaigning. You can still talk about national messages, but you do it from a local perspective because it's the local parliamentary candidate, local councillor who is the candidate who can win there and people can believe in, not necessarily the national party.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so the next question, we touched on it earlier, and it's about PR, which has been quite a big part, obviously, Lib Dem campaigning for a long time. And Richard Laurie asks, if the Labour Party adopts PR as a manifesto pledge, would candidates promote a strategy of election cooperation with them? Would they aid the brokering of a post-election deal in order to bring PR about? So I think kind of more specifically, how central should PR be to the party's messaging in the next election? And Ed, if I could ask you that first, please.
Well, Richard, if we get to a point where the Labour Party say that they will legislate for PR, STV PR or something close to it, like the Jenkins Commission, AV Plus, which was very close to STV. If they put that and said in their manifesto, they'll stand on that and they'll legislate in the first Queen's speech, then there's an interesting discussion to be had, isn't there? I still don't think we should have pacts and deals. A, because as I explained before, that doesn't work. And B, because it plays into Tories' hands. The Tories would love us to have a formal pact or a deal. We would need to not be seen as saying, oh, this is fantastic, hasn't it been brilliant, Labour's going to legislate on PR. You know, I think that would be the wrong approach. I think we still need to show a degree of maturity and caution. You know, there may be lots of Labour policies that, you know, we don't think are so good, and we will need to make it clear we disagree them on that. We play the choreography, but we know what we want, don't we? And people will know what we want. But we've got to make sure that that doesn't get in the way of all our other messages. And I go back to this. You start with the voters. And I tell you, the voters' interest in electoral reform is not huge, regrettably. What do they care about? They care about jobs. They care about education. They care about your caring. They care about the health service. They care about things that affect them and their families. And if we were to get sidetracked into campaign about, oh, whippy, the Labour Party's got electoral reform and we'll stitch it up together, the Tories will be rubbing their hands. And they'll use it to defeat us. So if that wonderful development happened, we've got to play it cool. We've got to focus on the job at hand. The job at hand will be winning those seats by talking to the voters on things that matter to them. And then let's see what happens after election. We all know what we want to achieve, don't we? But let's win elections first. And I will be obsessed by making sure there are more Liberal Democrat councillors, MSPs, members of the Senate, AMs, more councillors and MPs elected. That will be my job as leader, not to get carried away by the Westminster bubble.
And Layla, so the same question to you. I'll repeat what Richard's question was for you. Is if the Labour Party adopts PR as a manifesto pledge, would candidates promote a strategy of election cooperation with them? And would they aid the brokering of a post-election deal in order to bring PR about? And like I said to Ed before, it was kind of more broadly, how central should PR be to the party's message going forward into the next general election?
Yeah, thank you. So I think some of this we've answered a little bit before on me saying already that proportional representation and electoral reform is so important that we need to make sure that that would be in there. The problem I see in the Labour Party at the moment is actually there are many in their party that think they can win without us. And before we even get to that point, we have to really make the case to them that we are strong, that we are viable in enough seats that they are going to need us, so that we can have those conversations with them about proportional representation. And there is a movement within the Labour Party. Over 3/4 of Labour Party voters want proportional representation. There is actually more than half the country that believes that PR is the right thing to do. There is a Make Votes Matter Action Day, I think, that's happening tomorrow, where people are going to be talking about this and spreading the message. Most voters, when they think about what's going wrong with their democracy, don't really, however, start thinking about the electoral system. And by the way, you know, there's a lot else that also needs changing. Reform of the House of Lords. We also need proportional representation as part of local government. What I would like to focus on to make the case for this to people, the same people who are going to perhaps be influenced by this in the ballot box, is actually make it much more simple. And it's about ensuring that every citizen recognises that the state is there to serve them. That at the moment, under first past the post, you don't get the government that you voted for. Boris Johnson has a runaway majority on less than 50% of the vote. There is something deeply flawed about this. And that is in part what's leading to him being able to act with impunity at the moment, without any care for the chaos that him and his cabinet is creating. So I think the way that we make the case to this is actually by holding the government to account. We also have to be very careful that any sort of pact with Labour will be used against us in seats that we need to win, particularly against the Tories. So it needs to be behind the scenes with cross-party working. I have a track record of being able to do this. The People's Vote, the APPG I'm chairing at the moment on coronavirus, I have a good relationship with many of the people around Keir Starmer who sit on his shadow cabinet. I do believe that I can do that negotiating and that we will work well together, but it needs to be very much behind the scenes. Otherwise, it could risk hurting us.
Okay, we've talked about Labour a lot actually, and I wanted to ask about the Conservative Party. Stuart Bourne asked this question actually, says, given that the party is second to the Tories in 80 constituencies, which policies do you see as key to winning over moderate Tory voters? And Ed, I'd like to come to you with this one first, as Layla just spoke then. So I'll say that again. This was Stuart's question. Given that the party is second to the Tories in 80 seats, what policies or policy do you see as key to winning moderate Tory voters?
Well, it will depend on the seat, and it will depend on where the country is at the next election. But I think we can look at 2 or 3 areas. The first is I look at caring, not least because that will remind people of the absolute mess they've made of COVID. You know, when Boris Johnson said, protect our NHS, of course everyone agreed, but the absolute betrayal of the care homes and the people in the care homes and the staff in the care homes and their families. And people won't forget that. And if we are the champion of caring, of unpaid carers, of carers on carers allowance and care staff, I think that will cut through to a lot of Tories actually. Clearly we'll need to talk about the economy. And as an economist, degree in postgraduate in economics, I put myself in night school for my postgraduate I think I can talk very coherently to a lot of those soft Tories on those issues. And in my constituency over many years, I've gone after that Tory vote, and I've gone after it in a number of areas. I've gone after it on crime by campaigning for more police officers against Tory police cuts. That's actually hit a button with a number of Tory voters. And it's quite liberal to say there should be more police on the streets along with more youth workers and so on. And the other issue, which I think people forget about Tory voters, is they actually care about the environment. Yes, the environment's important for young people and so on, but don't underestimate its importance for people of all ages. They want to know that there's green space where they can go and walk. They want to know that the future for their grandchildren is secure. So those are the things I've campaigned on with quite a lot of success over a number of years in beating the Tories and getting those Tory votes in those critical areas. It's been a frustration of me in the last few months, not having a mandate as the actual leader in the inevitable period after a disastrous general election during a pandemic. It's been frustrating not to be able to get over more those arguments that will hit that Tory vote. But to a certain extent, Boris Johnson's been doing the job for us. He's been laying the ground for the success I know we can have in the future against those Tory voters in our key seats to win councils and to win parliamentary constituencies. They're not going to forget his record on caring. They're not going to forget his poor record on things like the environment and crime. So I'm very confident that with me as the leader, we can win over those soft Tory voters.
Thank you, Ed. And Layla, same question to you. What policies do you see as key to winning over those very important moderate Tory voters?
Thank you. Well, this question was what I wanted to answer after 2019's catastrophic general election. And the way that we're going to answer it needs to be a continuation of what I started. And it needs to begin by us recognizing that we have not been getting this right. That in many of those seats, Revoke was utterly toxic. And I told the story of the chap who said, we've got nothing in common. I'll tell you another. When I went door knocking, having long conversations with voters, asking them, what do you think of the Liberal Democrats? What would make you vote for us? And I remember a gentleman in North Cornwall, in Camelford, was speaking to him on the door. And I asked him that question, what would ever make you not vote Tory and vote Lib Dem? And the answer he gave was actually about over Brexit. Coronavirus hadn't happened yet. And he said, well, Boris Johnson, he's taken all the sweets and now he's got to eat them. And the point I think he was trying to make was Boris Johnson's competence is actually going to be the number one reason for people to consider not voting Tory. But in those seats, that is not going to be enough. And so we also need to win them over. And that's what I know how to do. Oxford West and Abingdon is a Tory-facing seat. I won it very narrowly with 816 votes in 2017, overturning a 10,000 Tory majority. And then I increased it again to over 50% last time. It's got rural bits, it's got Brexity bits. And actually, I know how to do it here. And we've seen how it's spread, and that reputation that we've developed here, winning back the trust of voters on both sides, has spread so that we've made leaps forward in both Witney and Wantage, but we have also won the Vale of Whitehorse District Council and South Oxfordshire District Council. So I have experience of doing it here. But what was also clear from those doors is that actually many of the things that those voters care about are things we care about too. So in this campaign, I've been talking about education, the environment, and the economy, the 3 E's. It was music to my ears when they said education was something we should go after. I was a teacher before I was an MP. And what better way of describing to people why we are Liberals than investing in the next generation? But also they recognise that Labour had kind of stolen a march on things like the NHS. And if we're going to communicate our commitment to strong public services, then education is a really important part of that. It worked, by the way, when Paddy Ashdown spoke about education. I want us to be the party of education again. And with the incompetence of this government and Gavin Williamson, actually, I think we're going to have plenty to talk about in that space too.
Okay, we're kind of rapidly running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one quick question before we went to closing speeches. This is a question from Heather Richards, party member, of course. And Layla, if I can ask you first, if you win the leadership, what role do you see Ed playing in the party?
A very, very big one. Ed has enormous experience. He's a stalwart of the party, and I want to lead this change, but I'm going to need the team around me. All 11 of us are frontbenchers. We are a team, but it also needs to be wider than that too. So we will have to have conversations about what specific role, but I will work with him whether I win or not, and really value that contribution. It's very, very important that we pull together when this is all over.
And the same question to you, Ed. If you emerge as the leader of the party, what role do you see for Layla?
Well, thank you, Layla, for your answer. Ditto. You've clearly been a fantastic MP for the 3 years you've been in Parliament. You've got a huge role to play for the party at senior level. I want to promote you if I win.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll now go to closing speeches, so about 2 or 3 minutes each, please. And Ed, I think if we can start with you, please.
I hope I've shown you I have the vision, experience and judgment to lead the Liberal Democrats. The campaigns ahead will not be easy given the challenges facing our party. As the Thornhill review showed, things aren't good and there are no quick fixes, and never has been. But the core message of the Thornhill review for me is that the party must stop talking to itself and start talking to the voters. Our priority campaigns must reflect the concerns of most voters, relevant to their worries, their hopes, their aspirations. We can then rebuild our party's unique liberal identity. Stronger again, we can take advantage of the opportunities opening up to us. Keir Starmer opens up the opportunity of many Conservatives voting for us, people who wanted to vote for us last December, but feared Corbyn more than they did Brexit. I believe I'm the best candidate to exploit that opportunity of Tory voters seeking a new home. From my economist and business background to my 20 years experience of getting Tories to vote for me. I've won 6 out of 7 elections I fought against the Tories in a seat we had never, ever held before, which had always been Conservative. I overturned a notional Tory majority of over 15,000 to win by 56 votes in 1997, and then turned it into a Liberal Democrat majority of over 15,000 4 years later. I'm the only MP in our party's history to win without being a target seat. I like beating Tories and building teams who are good at it. And I'm being touched by how many of our party's best campaigners are backing me as leader. Our amazing new MP for St Albans, Daisy Cooper. The brilliant councillor Hannah Kitching, taking Labour on in Barnsley. The inspirational Christine Jardine, MP for Edinburgh West. To the one and only councillor Shafak Mohammed, former MEP for Yorkshire and our group leader on Sheffield Council. Please join them and back me so we win again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And Layla, if you'd like to give us your closing remarks, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ned, and thank you so much all at home for watching. But also a massive thank you to the HQ team and Jack Coulson for all the brilliant work that you've done in putting these events together. Because this leadership election hasn't been the one that everyone was expecting, but then nothing is in the days of coronavirus. But it has brought the opportunities to have these online debates, and long may they continue. Our party is crying out for a strong liberal voice. Now more than ever, progressive liberal ideas are needed. And if you have already voted for me in this election, then I say thank you. But if you haven't, do it now. We have to rise to this challenge, to be the vehicle for the change that the country so desperately needs. But before we change our country, we have to first change our party. We have to show that we've learned the lessons from the last decade, that we are listening again, not just to ourselves and our supporters, but actually to voters across the whole country. And I'm standing because with me as leader, I know we will do better than our current 6% in the polls. I also have a plan to work with you, to build a strategy to win again. And it starts with better living our values, by listening to voters and showing that we're on their side through a core message, through strong media presence and an empowered activist base. And this is how I overturned a 10,000 Tory majority in my constituency, winning over thousands of moderate Conservative voters whilst consolidating the progressive vote. Vote for me as leader, and we can do this nationally. We can win back votes and change the way things are. And you can read more about my plan at votelayla.org/plan. I know that our members have the courage and the strength to rebuild and revive our party from the bottom up. And I am the leader who can help, not hinder you, by sending the country a strong signal that we have moved on from the last decade. Together, we can rebuild trust with voters. We can win again. Vote for me and let's move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you both. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's kind of just under a week until we'll know the results. You've got a few more days to make your minds up if you haven't yet. I hope tonight has helped you in some way. I've been Ned Simons of HuffPost UK. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, Ned. Thanks.